Thanks, Malcolm, for such a really enjoyable and fascinating talk. I really appreciated that. I was also curious about Verinda's point about gender and masculinity. So I don't work on UK-based jungle or grime, but I do work on hip hop in the French banlieue, and where this question of like gender disparity or the gender sort of diffraction of rap in that situation is very much mediated around questions of French republicanism, universality, questions around Islam. So it's mediated by this kind of framework, but also a sense of like what it means to stand up for one's brothers and fathers and sons in this particular kind of complex dynamic, and certain debates around what feminism is or what it should look like, end up going through this very complex sort of prism. And I was sort of wondering, I'm not imagining that there's a direct equivalent in the UK or London-based scene, but I wondered whether there are other things that kind of diffract these musical cultures through the question of gender, and what you kind of see in the particular context that you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of was initially thinking about it. I don't know if I can think about it exactly in the same way you are, but I think about it in terms of kind of control and broadcast and technology. And so the private radio endeavor, the desire to put yourself out across the city, is also an act of assertion. You know, if you read it in those kind of terms, these are kind of risky behaviors, climbing onto kind of tops of rooftops. They're kind of some way reaffirming of a masculinity. And obviously the kind of cat and mouse game with the authorities is part of a long held kind of territorial struggle for working class young people and you know, working class young people of color against the authorities and against the police. So there's definitely an arena of masculine contest. The scene itself, I mean, went through different phases. I mean, if you to go back to the beginning of it, you're really talking kind of the tail end of an acid house scene, you know, in a way. And I think some of the kind of patriarchal kind of stylings of jungle that are definitely quite strong by the end of the 1970s are probably more muted at the beginning. And so too in the squat party jungle scene, which I would kind of went to a lot of those, which was kind of also had a different kind of ethics. The dances were, as you see in the kind of videos, I mean, the dances themselves, I think probably, you know, about half the crowd were women. And so they weren't, I don't know, in that sense, kind of a, you know, a style or kind of performative culture that was dependent on kind of masculinity in that kind of sense. And they weren't in the whole, or the ones I went to, kind of sexually aggressive dance cultures either. There wasn't an expectation you were going to go to a jungle rave and you were going to leave with somebody. You were really there to dance. There wasn't really any touching. You can see the kind of proximities. People got close to each other, but there was it wasn't that kind of like British kind of pub kind of pulling culture either. But clearly saying that it was also a masculine culture in the ways I just said, and it was defined in the industry and in terms of the MCs and the DJs were probably the pirate radio stations as well. They're predominantly men, so it was a predominantly kind of male activity. Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm. Simon?
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that talk. I was kind of caught the kind of drum end of drum and bass in the late 90s and went a bit of clubbing. So I kind of missed that kind of really, well, not peak era of the kind of pirate radio. But yeah, I was listening to it. I think there are kind of three questions, if that's not too many. The first one is in Energy Rush by Simon Reynolds. He really links the kind of drug scene with dance music, and the kind of the drugs that they were making was affecting the type of music. So the kind of the faster and the harder drugs that they were taking produced a kind of much faster and kind of hardcore music scene. So I was just wondering whether you thought that that was linked to the kind of social economic environment as well, or whether it was just entirely drugs. I mean, Simon Reynolds is obviously very focusing on that specific point, but I suppose you could kind of ask, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Is it the demand, or is it the music scene is demanding the drugs, and kind of which is driving which? So the second step was that, I really hoped, well, I don't know if you talk about it in the book, but the kind of the dubstep scene, when you kind of talk about like urban environment, like Burial is the first kind of artist I immediately think of, and that just kind of and his debut album came out in 2005, which is still within that kind of Blair is kind of, I suppose it's kind of post Britpop, that vibe, but that and the dubstep scene was a lot more maybe cynical and a lot more kind of more linked to hauntology and that kind of maybe a chance missed. So I don't know whether you really talk about that, but I think that's an interesting kind of development of what you were saying. And finally, I was just thinking about Wiley. You mentioned him, and he's kind of one of those first grime artists that are a much more public figure. Yet last year he had a bit of a Twitter meltdown about kind of tweeting a lot of very anti-Semitic tweets, which seemed quite surprising for somebody who was brought up in this very kind of public-facing role. You could have imagined, in the 90s, like in kind of pirate radio, you'd have a lot more of that kind of controversy. As well, now you expect musical artists to be a lot more self-aware, maybe, or like kind of less likely to kind of broadcast those things. So yeah, that's just I really enjoyed the talk. Very good, thank you.
Thank you. I think obviously, I think you're referencing Mark Fisher on Burial. I think Mark Fisher on Burial is really good and kind of like really kind of answers that question about kind of hauntology. I think dubstep is a kind of important antecedent to these moments, and I think he writes about that well. I want to kind of say a bit more about the drugs thing though, because I think that's a kind of reading, and I see that a different way. I would say there's, a lot in the kind of 90s was written about drugs and ease and the kind of Irving Welsh stuff, and really it was kind of a story of drug culture and drugs. And as you could see from the rave, obviously quite a lot of the people in that rave were on ease. And ease was a part of jungle culture, and I guess kind of it was a way in which people who kind of felt the kind of strangeness of the city, or maybe the atomization of the time too, helped them feel closer together in a way they already wanted to feel closer to each other, if you know what I mean. But I disagree with the kind of, I know you're not saying this, but with Reynolds' kind of idea that it's kind of, it's drugs that pushes that encounter. And I think what I'm trying to kind of do is stage a more conjunctural analysis, I suppose, where I'm kind of looking at the emergence of these things together, because it's quite possible kind of to be in a rave without drugs. The kinds of sonic intimacies that you experience in dance and through music have a kind of particular feeling with these, but they're quite possible to have without them. And I would probably attribute more to the general kind of social and economic forces of the time in setting out the scene, what it was, and the alternatives to that it provided, which that's maybe a different point, but I don't see as the alternatives of the scenes I've talked about being kind of completely folded within dominance. They're not just the newness that springs from dominance, they have their own histories, trajectories as well. But the point is, I would see it much more as a kind of conjunctural, maybe a cultural studies analysis, where it's the social and economic forces of these things that really are creating the scene and the alternatives to that, and drugs is within that, but it's not the driving force of that, I don't think. Yeah.
Ed?
Hi, thanks very much. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Really enjoyed it. One of the threads that connects dub sound systems Jungle Pirate Radio and certainly drill, to a lesser extent grime YouTube videos for me, is their shared illegality or semi-legality, from blues dances in unlicensed venues in people's homes to Form 696, ASBOs for people like DJ Slimzy, who was barred from going above the 5th floor of a tower block to try and prevent him from setting up pirate transmitters, and drill artists like Skengdo and AM, who have been, I think, handed suspended sentences for performing a song that had an ASBO applied to it. To what extent do you see this concept of sonic intimacy as self-generated and emergent, and to what extent is it a self-protective response to direct interventions by the state targeting Black cultures and Black identity?
I mean, I see sonic intimacy as the kind of the relationality of sound, technology, and the social, in which kind of we understand, which move through the sonic primarily, and I'm particularly talking about Black diasporic sound culture, and that have kind of registers of intimacy, by which I mean presence, proximity, an understanding of oneness or wholeness, these kind of ways in which we use, you know, intimate presence, intimate proximity. This is what I mean. This is what I mean by intimacy. So what I'm trying to say with sonic intimacy is that kind of feeling, that feeling of our relationship with music, with sound, is important and hasn't been written enough about enough, right? And I'm saying that kind of feeling of the vibe or the buzz, what that means in terms of its cultural politics, needs to be discussed more, because in that common sense experience, that experience we all know, there's something at stake as it changes, as it moves. And that's why and that's what I'm saying about sonic intimacy. I'm saying the reasons why we don't see that is because we're so used to kind of certain kind of scripts and accounts of social life that we don't see how important that is. And I think the way then, if I was going to answer kind of the question on the criminalization of grime artists, of drill artists, is obviously Black, through the kind of history of the criminalization of Black culture, Black people, Black musics in the UK and connected to elsewhere. And I think also with the advent of YouTube and with the advent of a kind of system through which people could now pinpoint people, name people, facially recognize people, we get the kind of ability to police people and bodies in different ways through kind of computational technologies. And that's what I was saying about Giggs's video talking the hardest, and the kind of shocking treatment that was meted out to him because he produced a video that was supposed to kind of, was a kind of, that the police saw as being provocative and thought he was a gangster and things like this and that. So, I mean, I think Joy White's book Terraform talks about the criminalization of grime artists through video. And I think that's probably the reference for that discussion more broadly. But in terms of the transformation of sonic intimacy, I'd see that as being related to the kind of arrival of visual computational culture within Black diasporic music culture.
Thanks, Malcolm. Okay, Elon has just sent his apologies, had to go, but thanks for the talk. Any more questions? So, sorry, hang on, my screen's just gone.
Did you want to say something a bit more about how you feel drill might fit into it, Malcolm? Because I assume the book was written a few years ago, given the way these things pan out. Do you have any, I mean, you must have thoughts about drill in relationship to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the way in which drill is composed more through kind of more with reference, maybe with more attention to kind of Google Analytic kind of interchanges than I think was done in the more kind of earlier organic phases of grime. Certainly grime's a bit of a different thing now, because obviously it's a very kind of multi however many dollars kind of grossing platform. I mean, the big artists, not, there's still a kind of smaller scene. Most, I guess that's true to say of all scenes, most of the scene is made up by the people you don't know about. When, I mean, just in conversation, so it's more anecdotally, but speaking to kind of younger people younger than me who are kind of making music in that vein or other veins, they're much more aware of the ways in which they're looking at kind of their Google Analytics to look at where the music's, who's listening to their music. So if the music's being listened to in Chicago, as they're making their music, they're thinking about Chicago, or they, you know, it might be telling them that it's listening to elsewhere, but they're much more aware of that conversation and how kind of that consumption is happening. And so that's being organized in a different way to how it would be. Obviously, if you're on a pirate radio station, you're principally concerned with the people in your kind of 50-mile radius listening to you. So I think that's a change in drill. I think drill's obviously a kind of possesses a kind of or demonstrates a form of wisdom and of knowledge of kind of local contexts. It's kind of its modes and its styles, it's the genre that it is, it seems to fit kind of pretty well as a kind of form of wisdom on what it's like to live under 10 years of austerity in Tory Britain. But I'm kind of interested in how it's composed computationally, I suppose, through kind of things like Google Analytics. I think there's a difference in that. There's probably here a better place to say, actually, you know, I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that.
I'm just gonna quickly just take over from Nisha. I'm not sure if Nisha's screen is playing up, but I think there is someone in the chat who wants to ask a question. Is it Noah Cooper? I'm not sure if I got the name right.
Easy. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Thanks for putting it on. Great to hear all types of UK-based culture and UK urban music being discussed and being put on at a level like this. My question would be about the intimacy of music. Obviously, sound system culture is very intimate in the respect that it might take place within a community, on a street. There's a sense of local pride of the MCs and the DJs being from the area, for the area. There's always going to be importing music, maybe catting other styles, but when music is being consumed in analog, when we've got like, when you're playing your 10 inches or whatever, 7 inches, 12 inches on a sound system, there's always going to be a limit to what's being played and a limit to what the local engineers are able to do. Forwarding then to the tower blocks, pirate radio, there's a technological limit on outreach, on where the FM frequency can be picked up on. Even still, kind of prior to Google search analytics, and while we've still got like UKG transitioning into grime, there's a limit on the instrumentals, so people use refixes, flips, VIPs, things like this, and it's a very close-knit community. You say now about how grime is becoming a however many dollar industry, and I think it's very significant you say dollar. We're not talking pound sterling now, because grime has very much crossed the Atlantic. That was a big issue for gigs, big issue for Skepta in trying to cross across into the Atlantic in terms of applications for visas. Where we are now in a situation where the local has been atomized even more in terms of lockdown, these sort of local hubs of culture, of intimacy, have been completely reduced and shut down for the foreseeable future. Drill artists, drill itself, if we see that as a UK drill music, it's a part of the UK soundscape nowadays, but it is intimately linked to Chicago drill, to artists like Chief Keef. It's perhaps a less, I mean, the argument can be made for garage going back to house. Like you say, it all stems back to acid house in some respects, or at least with the sound system back to, like Lovers Rock and things like that, Blue Beat. But do you feel there's a sense of a UK-based music becoming dissipated and far more globalized. And if Google Analytics suggests that listeners are in Chicago, this local intimacy is, or regionality, or however which way we want to look at it, is going to be cast adrift as a more globalized soundscape takes place.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think like you're covering the basis of the answer as well. I mean, obviously, like it's not, you know, as you've just kind of said, we're not moving from a situation of a music that's purely local to one that's global, because it's the musics we're already talking about are already kind of diasporic musics. They're kind of traces of other things kind of, you know, across the Atlantic, mainly we're talking about today, that become kind of reiterated in certain places to make sense of what they are. But at the same time, there is a kind of change in the relationship. I think about that in terms of the kind of technology of sound, a change in the technology of sound that asks different kind of questions in the way you just say. You know, something really important in the kind of distinction that you also make there, Noah, between the finite and the infinite. For lots of the sound cultures, a condition of finitude was actually important for people to be able to imagine themselves in the sound or in some kind of way. So if, you know, I always find it interesting that in lots of the pirate radio recordings, the definition is often London town, right? It's London town. It's London as a neighborhood. It's the metropolis of 1 million people, imagined down to something that we can all belong to, like a town or something like that. And that could be considered to be a conservative move in some respects, but it's more about people being able to imagine themselves in each other, imagine yourself with other people, the idea of being from London. And even though I wasn't from London, I was from Hertfordshire, I could fully kind of participate in that narrative of London town somehow. And so that kind of, the idea of finitude in some senses, the idea of the ability to imagine yourself in the other through sound and technology is important to the sonic intimacies of the reggae sound system and Jungle Pirate Radio, and the infinitude and the kind of breaking of time and the atomization kind of pastiche effect of digital media does something else to that. So, and it's not really an answer, but I mean, I think I'm saying I think about that the same way as you, kind of on those terms. Yeah.
Thanks, Noah, for that question, and thanks, Malcolm. There's a question in the chat from Luke De Nerona, who says, brilliant event, thanks all. I haven't read the book, but I'm really interested in hearing about the technological part of the culture, political economy, technology triad, if that's the right way of framing things. What difference did handheld devices? Sorry, someone.
I'm happy to be surprised. You're the one who keeps coming to me. I have to ask you because it might be that.
Someone needs to unmute themselves. I'm not sure who it is. Otherwise, we'll be privy to a private conversation. Sorry, so I'll just continue with the question. It's in the chat, but I'll read it out. So what difference did handheld devices versus computers make? And also, how did you give Virender that fuzzy feeling after he finished it, if you do contend with algorithms and the digital? I guess many of us are finding it harder to salvage the hope online, given surveillance capitalism, etc. Sorry, that's a broad question, but I want to know how you relate to wider debates on tech.
I think I gave Virender a fuzzy feeling because Virender is an inherent optimist, basically. So he's read, he sees the optimism in things, and that's why that's a good quality, kind of, you know, yeah, that kind of Gramscian quote now escapes me. So yeah, handheld devices. So yeah, obviously the kind of the advent of YouTube handheld devices, mobile phones with cameras and video recordings, they're all part of the same, they come about at the same time and they're kind of tightly held together. I'm not sure that I understand that kind of optimistically in a sense, but I'm not trying to be, what I'm trying to do in the book is, or better put maybe, rather than be kind of melancholic and nostalgic, as, you know, Verinda noted, is problematic. What I've tried to do is carefully trace through a kind of number of different threads in terms of what their transformation has been over time in relationship to the kind of social and economic political forces of the day, and where other things have risen up and might give us cause to kind of focus on things. Some things have remained persistent. There's no doubt that the musics we're talking about, whatever their technologies, contain versions of wisdom that are alternative. That is to say that they are within modernity, but kind of semi-autonomous forms of knowledge within that. So it's not just, as I was trying to say before and failed, it's not like Butler or Barber would have it. It's not the newness that just comes out of the contradictions of modernity. So it's held within dominance. I'm actually kind of trying to say that there are currents and streams that we can follow through of alternative culture that are within modernity, but can't actually just be folded through or explained in their relationship to dominance just. So I guess kind of the optimism in that is to kind of see where those things are persistent and where they come up. I think that kind of other people have made this comment, but you know, the reintroduction of the MC's voice in grime is a very interesting kind of moment, because the kind of possibilities of kind of the emotional register of the human voice, its ability to convey kind of sentiments and capture the moment wasn't really there in Jungle. And so that brings a kind of a humanism to a genre that's otherwise often quite kind of, so it's humorous too, but it's quite kind of stark in lots of its regards. And so in terms of the kind of, one of those tracings is then the kind of tracing of kind of technology, it's kind of computational capture, and you rightly kind of relate that to surveillance. And we could talk about that in terms of a lack of empathy, the difficulty as we're experiencing now and always in the lockdown. And I think that's a good moment to think about it, of actually being intimate and being intimate with sound or being intimate with each other. And so I can't be too positive about what those changes mean in terms of a kind of alternative humanism that we might be looking for at this particular moment of planetary decline and stratospheric capitalism, and you know, the ways in which kind of the violence of the ways in which kind of algorithms are socially coded and these technologies used. And I do think too, sorry, this is a very long answer, that this coronavirus moment, the confinement, the use of these technologies now routinely maybe helps people see some of the implications that they have that were otherwise kind of clouded by people's more routine consumer habits, you know, the ability to go down to the pub or to a club or get a coffee or meet somebody in the library helped us kind of ignore the particular effects that some of these kinds of computational cultures have on social life. So maybe it clarifies something for us as well.
Thanks for that, Malcolm. I think, Simon, do you have your hand up again? Would you like to ask a question? I think you can unmute yourself as well. I hope.
Oh, yeah. Just kind of thinking about that kind of transformation. I was wondering that move. So in 1992, I think it's the Criminal Justice Act, which was kind of quite a large legal movement to kind of shut down. And they had this specific line which kind of reflected on repetitive beats. But then kind of 5 years later, I think it was, that Ronnie Size won the Mercury Music Prize. But in kind of making music that was very much not for the rave scene. I mean, it's kind of, it is a great album, but it's also, you know, kind of the soundtrack to a million dinner parties in the late 90s, along with kind of Portishead as well, and that kind of trip hop scene, which is equally. So I was just wondering whether you think that in order to kind of have that acceptance, like did the music have to kind of change? Because it also became more, because they kind of moved into the clubs, and then it became easier to kind of make money and to make capital for people as well. So I'm just wondering what kind of, whether it could have carried on surviving as it did, or whether it had to mutate to kind of accept and engage with capitalism and that kind of wider kind of middle class community to continue to have that underground, or whether it kind of naturally, I don't really know what else could it done, but whether it needed to change into and kind of go down those flows. Otherwise it would have been kind of made completely illegal. They would have just shut down the raves altogether, and that would be it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's no reason to kind of, I'm sure people in the scene, you know, wanted to hang on to Jungle, and Jungle to continue to be the kind of defining centre of British popular cultural life or alternative cultural life in some ways, and indeed they still do probably. But there's no reason for us as kind of, you know, people who are looking at it from a cultural studies perspective to want that or desire it or to miss it when it goes. It just by 97 it wasn't capturing the energies of a lot of young people's lives anymore, and that's why UK Garage comes, because it's doing something else. It's doing something else. The rise of the MC is really important in that as well. It's just not there by then. You know, you're right. I mean, Jungle's still got a big following, kind of in definitely into the kind of 2000s. You know, nationally, but it's not really kind of got. It's not really got the vitality that's coming out of UK Garage at that moment, and grime kind of takes over from that. And that's the way it should be. And as long as that does happen, then, you know, we're in quite a kind of healthy situation in some respects, because we've got the kind of emergence and channeling of alternative energies and their kind of public expression. The concern would be obviously is where if that ever kind of ceased, and then we would just be in a world of consumer pastiche and kind of don't know, getting our kind of energies and kicks off whatever kind of, you know, stuff is kind of pumped at us through our phone screens.
Yes, sounds dreary. I think we have another question from, is it Panthea? Did I say your name right?
I can't hear you, Panthea. You
Okay.
need to.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Really wonderful talk, Malcolm. Thank you so much. And I actually bought your book, so it's arrived. And I was just curious about some of the lyrical content and some of the ethos of the scenes you're talking about, and maybe how they've also changed over time in terms of the kind of, I guess, the conception of the self and capitalism and just the systems with which these scenes are contending with, you know, the self-awareness. It's just kind of a natural thing for me to, I guess, compare it to American hip hop and that kind of the way that, you know, hip hop that's mainstreamed is specifically lacking in those things, or can even be, you know, a kind of mascot for hyper capitalism and these sorts of things. But I'm really curious about those aspects of your findings. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think an important question too. So in the book, I'm not saying that any of the kind of sound cultures I'm talking about are outside of capitalism at all. They're all within capitalism. They all involve kind of some kind of profit making or money making, but often very minimal. Nobody's getting rich, you know what I mean? I mean, nobody's getting rich until YouTube, probably. You know, yeah. So that's so, but the logics of capitalism are there in sound systems and in pirate radio, where lots of people, there are people in the scene who kind of think about themselves in kinds of terms of Thatcherite entrepreneurialism and even branding, you know what I mean? Not saying that defined the scene, but there are those kind of discourses in there. And there's a lot on kind of, you know, there's a lot of that in grime as well, people talking about themselves as pop-up businesses and things like that. So we kind of have, obviously, because we live in a kind of capitalist society, the scripts of kind of capitalism defining the scene, they're not wholly without that. And so to kind of, the risk of saying that they would be to kind of over romanticize these kind of music cultures and to kind of detach them from modernity. And obviously that kind of problem of detaching Black sound cultures from modernity has other more worrying kind of ascriptions as well. And so it's to say that they're wholly within modernity. We find the kind of, we find the entrepreneur figure, we find the kind of the masculine scripts of success, you know, within the scenes as well, that are also kind of conditioned by capitalism. And yeah, so they're absolutely there, but at the same time, there's also something else going on. I think that's what I'm kind of trying to say.
Yeah, I think any other questions? I mean, from what I can see, there's a lot of wonderful complimentary comments in the chat about the discussion and the book. It sounds like a brilliant book. I'm going to give, if there are no other questions or hands raised, I'm going to give Virender the opportunity for a couple of minutes to talk about what it is that made him feel warm and fuzzy.
No, I can, you just have to read the last 4 lines. I'll read the last 4 lines of the book to you.
Okay.
And that will give you all the warmness and fuzziness that you want. Am I allowed here?
Yes, please. That would be really nice.
So, the sonic intimacy of Black diasporic sound cultures is an avenue through which these alternatives can be heard. Relation, craft, great time, wisdom, finitude, mutuality and wholeness exist as possible pathways to greater mutual living. It is in their autonomy and poetry that humanity could thrive. And it has been in the sonic intimacy of Black diasporic culture, at least until now, that some of their vitality has been sustained. How could you not feel warm and fuzzy with great lines like that?
Absolutely. Do you have any last comments to say, Malcolm? I was going to say, given those beautiful lines, here's to autonomy and poetry, and Black diasporic cultures, and etc., transnational diasporic cultures, I would say. That's, you know, it's really beautiful. So a couple of closing comments from you, Malcolm, but also let us know where one could find your book, if you will.
The book can be found kind of at all disreputable and reputable sellers. So go to the reputable ones, I suppose. I don't want to say anything else. Just thank you very much. Thank you, Virender, for those kind words as well just there. And yeah, and thank you, Goldie and Nisha too. And thanks for all the questions. It's been really great. Yeah, thinking about these things and trying to think through some answers. And yeah, if you get around to reading the book and you have any thoughts and you want to get in contact, then give me a shout, and I'd be very happy to talk to you more.
It sounds lovely. Thank you so much. I don't know if everyone wants to raise their hands for a clap. If we would, if we were face to face. Thank you so much. Thanks to Nisha for in a very short notice. Well, thanks to Nisha for recommending Malcolm actually to come, and then also at short notice introducing and moderating the event. I can't add any more, I think, to the lovely chat comments there. It says thank you. The last person says thank you, Ravina says thank you, Malcolm, and everyone for this event. It's great to be able to access these spaces. Also, your theorizing around vibe hype has been very useful to me, and definitely untheorized. And so, yeah, lots of comments. I think someone was asking for a discount for the book. I don't know if you're able to do that. But on that note, sorry, did you want to say something?
I can. If people want a discount, I can. Yeah, they just have to send me a message and I will get them a discounted copy. That's fine, of course.
That's what we like to hear. Thank you.
Or you can get a free PDF for nothing if you email me as well. But obviously you want the real thing, more intimacy.
Thank you. On that note, we shall end here. I mean, I think people, if you want to stay on and chat, please do so. If you want to just have an informal conversation. Otherwise, really good to see you. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Malcolm, of course. It was really a pleasure listening to you and listening to all that music. Thank you.
And I have more, Malcolm, if you want to talk about the book a bit more.